The phone screen lights up. You type, turn it off, rewrite it. One sentence was enough, but it becomes a block. Then another one. Your body has already decided. It's better to over-explain than to risk silence. You anticipate reactions that didn't happen. He is defending himself against accusations that no one made. It's not just talk, it's a negotiation. You're not talking about lateness, absence, or no. It's saying, please don't take me away from here. And perhaps that's why they treat you like someone who always needs to justify their own space. Like if this was hard to hear. You'll notice it when you do it. It's not a conscious decision. It's a reflex. Something small happens, and before you even feel your own body, you're already explaining it. A delay becomes an excuse, an absence becomes a report, a no becomes a disguised apology. You don't explain the fact, you explain it to yourself, as if existing without a caption were too risky. It's not about education, it's not about consideration, it's about the fear of losing your place. The text grows because, deep down, you feel that a short sentence doesn't encompass who you are. You prolong the conversation because you believe, even if you've never put it into words, that the other person needs to understand in order not to drift away. And understanding here is not the same as comprehending. It's about accepting it. There is a silent scene that repeats itself. You revise the message 3 times, change words, soften the tone, add context, anticipate reactions that don't yet exist. All of this happens before any real response. The judgment has already been made, but not by the other side. For you. Carl Jung observed that when an individual does not occupy their own center, they attempt to secure themselves through excessive adaptation to external expectations. This is not a quote to memorize, it's an unsettling diagnosis. Because over-explaining doesn't stem from caring for others, it stems from distrust in you. There is an implicit contract at work. If I explain it properly, I still belong. If I explain it well, I won't be rejected. If I explain everything, maybe I won't lose my job. This contract was not signed today. He comes from far away, perhaps from a time when you learned that being direct came at the cost of affection, or that silence was interpreted as a mistake, or that disagreeing needed to be accompanied by an apology. So you learned to anticipate. He needs to correct himself before being accused, to justify oneself before being questioned. The problem is that, over time, explanation ceases to be a tool and becomes an identity. You only come into existence after you explain yourself, and without realizing it, she begins to live as if her presence alone is not enough. When you over-explain yourself, you're not being clear. You are asking for permission to exist, and the more you ask for permission, the weaker your position becomes. Because the other person learns something about you. You learn that you don't trust your own place. This is the point that almost no one wants to look at. Excessive explanation does not protect. She exposes. It reveals a broken inner authority. And authority, contrary to what they taught, is not built with extra words. It begins where you stop defending yourself before being attacked. But this comes at a cost, and he doesn't show up right away. It shows in how you are treated afterwards. You call it care, but the body knows it's a plea. Begging for space is not the same as kneeling. It's explaining more than is necessary. It's about justifying simple feelings. It's about transforming personal choices into defensive arguments. You don't just say, "Ma, I can't." You say, "I can't because I'm tired, because it was a tough week, because it's not personal, because I thought about it a lot before deciding." And in the end, he even apologizes. Not because he made a mistake, but because he is afraid. There is a silent confusion between being respectful and being submissive. There's a difference between being clear and justifying oneself, between maturity and fear of rejection. You learned that if you don't explain, you'll be perceived as cold, which, if not contextualized, will be seen as unfair. If it doesn't soften its stance, it will lose its place. So you anticipate it. It constructs a text that attempts to control how the other person reads it. You don't communicate, you negotiate. Negotiate acceptance, negotiate to stay, negotiate the right to remain there. The problem is that every negotiation starts from a premise, and hers is this: the way I am, perhaps it's not enough. That's why the explanation is so emotionally charged. Too much detail, too much worry. You're not saying what happened, it's saying, or please don't reject me because of this. Hey, the explanation becomes a belated request for authorization, an attempt to become acceptable after the fact. And the more you do this, the more you teach the environment how to treat you. Because relationships learn quickly. They can tell who is supporting themselves and who needs to explain themselves to avoid being discarded. When you over-explain yourself, something changes in the dynamic. The other person starts expecting an explanation. He begins to interpret silence as guilt. He starts to find it strange when you don't stretch your legs. Not because you're wrong, but because the pattern was broken. There is an invisible cost to begging for space. You move away from the center itself. You come to exist in function of the other person's reaction. And it's not just about the message sent. This enters the body, in the way they speak, in posture, in a tone of voice that asks permission even to occupy one's own life. You start living as if you're always in debt, as if he needed to prove that he deserved to be there. And perhaps the most unsettling question isn't why you explain so much, but since when did you learn that you needed to? There comes a point when explaining ceases to be a choice and becomes a conditioned reflex. You don't even notice it anymore. The body responds before consciousness. The explanation emerges as a mechanism for social survival. Before anyone even questions you, you're already defending yourself. Even before someone walks away, you're already trying to avoid the loss. This doesn't happen because you're insecure in the superficial sense of the word. It happens because, at some point, you learned that taking up space without justification had consequences. Perhaps it wasn't a major rupture. Sometimes it was just a sideways glance, a prolonged silence, irony disguised as a joke. But the body registers, and the body learns. So you went on to explain how to stay safe. Explain in order to stay inside. Explain so as not to be misunderstood. The problem is that continuous explanation doesn't keep you protected. It keeps you predictable. When you over-explain, you give away the entire blueprint for how it works. Show me where it hurts. Show where you're afraid. It shows where it is still seeking validation. Validation is not the same as a link. Validation is fragile. It depends on the other person's response. No connection. A bond can withstand silence. It supports disagreement. It supports choices that are not accompanied by emotional justification. But to sustain that, you need something that hasn't been trained in you: internal authorization. Without this authorization, every decision becomes a risk. Every limit becomes a threat. Every absence becomes an anticipated guilt. Then you explain, to try to neutralize the impact, to try to control the reading, to try and ensure that it will still be accepted later. But control never generates respect. It creates dependency. And the more you depend on the understanding of others to exist in peace, the further you move away from your own center. You start living as if you're always about to be kicked out of something. From a relationship, from a group, from a symbolic place that you never felt was truly yours. And this is where explanation becomes identity. It's not something you do anymore. It's something that you are. The person who always clarifies things, which is always justified, always anticipating things. And without realizing it, you teach the world to only accept you after a convincing explanation. But there is a silent point that almost no one addresses. The more you explain, the less authority you convey. Not because the other person is cruel, but because authority arises from that which does not need to be defended. And what still needs to be defended, that's because you haven't authorized it yet. There is a dangerous fantasy surrounding the explanation, the one that she preserves relationships with. In practice, it preserves the role you occupy in them. When you over-explain yourself, you're not being kind. You are keeping an invisible contract running. A contract where you offer emotional predictability in exchange for permanence. Where the other person knows you won't disappear without warning. That won't change without justification. Someone who won't say no without apologizing. This creates comfort, but it doesn't inspire respect. Because respect is born when the other person perceives that you remain whole, even without explaining every step. When you understand that you don't need to be understood in order to exist. When you feel like you can support yourself, And that's exactly what changes when you stop explaining yourself. It doesn't change its shape nicely. It changes in an uncomfortable way. People find it strange. Some become restless. Others try to pull explanations from where they no longer exist. Everything is fine? Mumbo, you're different. Sure, did I do something? Not because you did something wrong. But that's because the old access was cut off. Previously, they had direct access to their internal processes. Now they find a silent limit. And the silent boundary bothers those who have become accustomed to moving around without barriers. Here, a common misconception arises. To think that ceasing to explain oneself is to shut oneself off. It is not. It's about taking a stand without asking permission. When you respond with fewer words, the environment begins to react. Some people respect it. Others are testing. Others walk away. This doesn't mean you made a mistake. It's a sign that something has changed in the invisible hierarchy of the relationship. Those who depended on his explanation to feel safe now feel threatened. Those who relied on their preconceived guilt lose their footing. Those who confused access with privacy are beginning to reveal their discomfort. And here's the point that almost no one says out loud. Not every relationship survives when you stop making excuses. Some existed precisely because you explained yourself, because it was decreasing, because he was asking permission to be. When that ends, the bond needs to be reconfigured, or it dissolves. This requires preparation, not emotional in the comfortable sense, but structural. Because stopping explaining yourself isn't just about changing a behavior. It's assuming an authority you've never fully exercised before. And authority has a cost. It takes you out of a pleasant place, from the place of predictability, from an easy place. It puts you in a position where the other person needs to deal with their own frustration, instead of you trying to soften the blow with words. That's why so many people change their minds. Not because he didn't understand, but because he couldn't handle the reaction. But there's something even more expensive than dealing with this discomfort. To continue living as someone who needs to justify themselves in order to survive. And this choice, even if made silently, exacts a daily price. There is a fine line between presence and explanation. And you learned how to cross it all the time. You call it clarity. But in practice, it's a silent plea not to be punished for existing outside of expectations. When you stop explaining yourself, something changes in the way people treat you. Not because you've become arrogant, but why did you stop putting yourself down? At first, this creates noise, or head environment. People are looking for the old you. The one who translated everything, softened everything, anticipated everything. And when they don't find it, they try to provoke. The questions are laden with strangeness. The tone changes. Sometimes a veiled accusation arises. Coldness, selfishness, distance. It's not a direct attack. It's an attempt to restore the standard. Because when you explained yourself, the game was comfortable. The other person didn't need to deal with their own discomfort. You were doing that job for him. Now it doesn't do that anymore, and this exposes something delicate. Many people didn't connect with you personally, but with the accessible version of yourself that you offered. Without explanation, the relationship is left bare. Without shock absorbers, no emotional caption. Some retreat, others adapt, others reveal irritation. All of this is information, not about you, but regarding the position you held. Carl Jung said that what is not integrated returns as fate. Here, not as a pretty phrase, but as a warning. As long as you don't integrate your own authority, it returns in the form of relationships that constantly put you in a position to explain yourself. When you stop, the field changes, and the field responds. This is the most critical moment, because this is where many people interpret the external reaction as proof of an internal error. You think, maybe I'm exaggerating. Perhaps I should explain it better. Perhaps I was too harsh. And it's explained again. That's how the cycle continues. Stopping the need to explain oneself requires enduring a temporary void. A space where the other person doesn't yet know how to deal with you. And you still haven't gotten used to not asking for permission. This break is uncomfortable because he takes away your old paper without handing over a new one that is ready. You are no longer what you explain. but he still doesn't feel whole enough to simply be. This is where most people back down, not out of cowardice, but due to a lack of internal structure, because maintaining silence without guilt requires something rare. Accept that not everyone will understand, and that this is not a problem to be solved. When you don't explain yourself, you force the other person to deal with their own interpretation. And this changes the invisible hierarchy of the relationship. Some people will treat you differently, others leave, and some, a very few, will finally find you for real. This is not an immediate gain, it's a cost, but perhaps the greatest cost is continuing to live as someone who is only accepted after justifying themselves. The question that begins to emerge is no longer about how to explain it better. It's about how long you are still willing to pay to maintain a place that was never truly yours. There comes a point where ceasing to explain oneself stops being behavior and becomes a breakdown. Not external, internal. It's when you realize you're no longer willing to interpret every gesture to ensure acceptance. When you understand that continuing to explain costs more than the discomfort of not being understood. This is where the quietest turnaround of all takes place. You start responding less justification. To stop sentences from ending where you would previously add paragraphs. And along with that comes the impact. Not everyone reacts well when you stop asking for permission. Some miss the old predictability, others interpret it as a threat. Some try to put you back in your old place with subtle phrases, but ones that are full of judgment. You've been acting strangely, Jake. You used to explain things better, Jake. It's getting colder. This is not a diagnosis about you, it's a reaction to the loss of control. When you explained yourself, the other person had access to your internal process. He knew where to step, I knew how far to go. Now he doesn't know anymore. And here comes a phrase that cuts more than it consoles. Anyone who only respects you when you explain yourself has never truly respected you. They respected your effort. Carl Jung stated that what an individual cannot tolerate in themselves, they try to control in others. When you stop explaining yourself, you stop offering that control. That's why the reaction. You stop mitigating the discomfort of others, and the other person has to deal with their own discomfort without your help. This reveals who was in a relationship with you and who was feeding off your guilt. There is no neutrality at this moment. The countryside is reorganizing itself. Some relationships become harder, others walk away, a few delve deeper, not because you've become a better person, but because he stopped being someone who was too available. And this is where the risky phrase comes in, the one that nobody likes to hear, but almost everyone denies. Anyone who needs to explain themselves in order to exist doesn't yet exist in its entirety. This hurts because it shifts the responsibility. It's not in the other one anymore, it's in the inner space you occupy. Stopping the need to explain yourself isn't about shutting your mouth. It's about breaking the invisible contract that said you needed to be understood to have value. When that contract breaks down, there is no relief left. Silence prevails. And silence does not embrace. Silence tests. It is there that you discover if you can sustain your own presence without a caption, no defense, no apology needed in advance. This is also where many people back down. Let me explain again. It's getting softer again. Ask for permission again. Because sustaining this place requires something rare, the ability to lose old positions without any guarantee of new ones. It is at this point that explaining ceases to be a habit and becomes a conscious choice. And every real choice has a cost. The question that is beginning to echo is neither comfortable nor kind. Who would you be if you stopped asking permission to be who you already are? Don't reply too quickly. This question doesn't require clarity. He wants structure, and it can't be solved by explaining. From here on out, nothing is comfortable. Because joining this movement isn't about feeling better, it's about supporting a more expensive place. When you stop explaining yourself, you don't get applause. Receive silence. And silence confirms nothing. You begin to realize how much you used explanation as an emotional regulator of the environment. She organized the other one. It calmed me down. He avoided conflict. Without it, the discomfort appears raw. And that's where many people confuse maturity with coldness. Confuses setting limits with indifference. Confuses presence with distance. You feel the urge to correct the reading, to explain that this is not the case, to soften the impression. But if you do that, everything will come back. To integrate is to not go back. It's about realizing that the anxiety that arises is not a sign of error, but of a shift in focus. Your body is relearning how to exist without asking permission. This costs money. It costs to have easier relationships. It costs you the image of being a rich, good person. It costs you the feeling of being in control. You lose the comfortable position of someone who is always understood, and it enters the unstable territory of those who manage to hold on, even when they are not. That's the real price. And he is not paid all at once. He appears in small scenes, in unanswered messages, in invitations that are dwindling, in people who distance themselves without explanation. You don't gain something immediately, you lose first. The mask of explanation is lost. The false sense of security is lost. You lose the role that kept you accepted, and if you try to compensate for that by seeking new approval, it all starts again. That's why this point requires structure, not willpower. A structure designed to withstand being misinterpreted without defending itself. A framework to support choices without a caption. A structure designed to avoid turning every reaction from others into a personal problem. Here, some realize that following this type of reading is not entertainment. It's a confrontation. Only those who can endure it remain. Perhaps that's why it makes sense to keep following this space. Not to learn something new, but to not forget what it costs to maintain this place when the world tries to pull you back. Integration is not about closing the loop. It's about accepting that he doesn't shut down. You end up living without the relief of having an explanation, but also without the constant drain of needing to prove that it deserves to exist. And that changes everything on the inside, even when nothing changes on the outside. The mistake is expecting a feeling of victory. It's not coming. What follows is a kind of firm silence, a less soft but real floor. And on that ground, the question ceases to be, what will they think? It becomes something else, more bothersome. How much of myself was I giving away just to keep fitting in? This question doesn't solve anything. She moves, and those who are displaced do not return to their former place without paying an even higher price. So we're left here with no easy closure. There comes a point when you realize you're no longer just changing a behavior. You are switching psychological identities. Before, you were the understanding person, the accessible one. She explained everything to avoid creating friction. Now you begin to occupy a different place. The one who doesn't offer themselves entirely for validation. The one whose translation doesn't fit. The one who sustains their own existence without a caption. This exchange is not symbolic. She is concrete. It appears when you leave a short message and don't come back to add to it. When someone says no and doesn't explain why. When you change your mind and don't feel the need to justify your internal shift. And each of these scenes produces an effect, or head environment. Relationships are strained, some are reorganizing, others break. None of this is abstract. It's an everyday occurrence. It is measurable. And here's something that almost no one names. Stopping explaining yourself changes your relationship with yourself. You begin to realize how much you narrated in order to exist. How much did he depend on external understanding to feel that he was entitled to be there? Without the explanation, a void emerges, not emotional in a dramatic sense, but structural. You no longer have the script you used to defend yourself. You no longer have the discourse that kept you safe. You are exposed to yourself. This is the point where many people try to replace the explanation with something else. Due to hardness, ironically, due to emotional distance, but that's just another mask. What's at stake here isn't closing oneself off. It's about supporting oneself. To support oneself when the other person doesn't understand, when you misinterpret it, when designing, when you walk away. To support oneself without scrambling to correct one's image. This requires something that cannot be learned quickly, quiet confidence in one's own inner position. Not that inflated confidence that needs to be asserted, but the one that doesn't need defending. This is where Jungian reading cuts the deepest. Because in Jungian terminology, what you're doing is drawing energy away from the persona constructed to please others and bringing it back to the self. Not as a concept, as a cost. All energy withdrawn from the persona leaves a temporary void. and that emptiness is frightening. That's why the urge to explain returns. He always comes back, especially when the other person reacts badly. And here comes the blade that offers no consolation. As long as you need to explain yourself to be accepted, you're not in a relationship. It's still adapting. A relationship presupposes two centers. Adaptation presupposes a center and an effort. To stop explaining oneself is to abandon adaptation. And this doesn't come with a manual. You lose your old place before you get a new one. You abandon the identity that worked before to feel secure in the next one. It's a psychological rite of passage, and every rite of passage requires loss. It is at this point that some find the book The Forgotten Agreement by Luciana Santos not as a promise of a solution, but as a vestige of someone who named this cost without romanticizing it. Not to follow, but to acknowledge that this type of crossing is not an isolated event. Still, nobody crosses for you. And perhaps the final question isn't about stopping having to explain ourselves. That much is clear now. The question that remains, and one that doesn't require a quick answer, is another. Who do you stop being when you stop begging for space? And who is left when there is no one left to convince?